Hi, everybody. Well, here we are beginning our last unit of the course. We have talked about the pre-Socratics, Socrates, Plato, and now Aristotle. This will round out our survey of ancient Greek thought. This week, I want to walk through three main areas of Aristotle's work based on our readings from chapters 7 and 8 of Guthrie. And then next week, we're going to read some passages from Aristotle's book, The Nicomachean Ethics. Don't get scared about the title. Nicomachus was his son. He wrote a book for his son about ethics. So that's all. Let's talk about Aristotle. All right. Get this working here. All right. So Aristotle was born in 384 BCE in Stagira in North Greece. He was a student of Plato. So Plato was a student of Socrates, and Aristotle was a student of Plato. At 17, he joined Plato's academy, which was that school Plato set up after the death of Socrates. He did well, and by 342 BCE, remember we're counting down before the Common Era dates, he was invited to be a tutor to a boy named Alexander. Well, Alexander, things worked out pretty well for him. He became Alexander the Great, the king of Macedon, and united the whole Mediterranean world, even all the way toward India, creating what we later called the Hellenistic world. So that refers to a period of time when Greek culture was especially influential in this region as a result of Alexander's conquests. Aristotle, after working with Alexander, founded his own school, like Plato's academy, but it was called the Lyceum. And this Lyceum had just a sidebar here, right? Had a little walkway, which the Greek term for this is a peripatos, covered walk. And so the students of Aristotle came to be known as the peripatetic philosophers, because what they would do is they would walk down along this covered walk and they'd talk about philosophy, right? So they didn't have, well, perhaps they did have classrooms, but, in addition, they had a covered walkway. So Aristotle dies in 322 in a self-imposed exile. Well, why did he impose that on himself? Because Athens wanted to bring charges against him of, you guessed it, impiety. And Aristotle said, I'm not going to let the citizens of Athens sin against philosophy twice. There we have it. The first topic I want to talk about is Aristotle's metaphysics, and then we'll go on to talk about his metaphysics, his psychology, and his ethics. Those are our three topics for today. Starting with the metaphysics, we have an image here of the worldview, the geocentric worldview, that is, with the Earth at the center of the cosmos, representing the view of Ptolemy, somewhat later thinker, who based his ideas on Aristotle and kind of finalized it into the geocentric world picture. That, of course, continued until Copernicus somewhat later. All right, so how do we situate Aristotle in relation to what's come before? Well, Guthrie is very helpful with this, and he suggests that we understand his relation to Plato in this way. Remember the picture that we've seen before. I think it's the cover picture of the course, right? Plato is pointing up, and Aristotle is gesturing down, right? So Plato is looking at a world of forms, a world of ideas, we just talked about this, right, that exists beyond the everyday world, right? It's outside of the everyday world, a two-world theory. Well, Aristotle is a one-world man, right? He wants to talk only about this world. So he retains this language of forms, but he understands it differently. For him, Plato's view, it was hard to make sense of because it wasn't clear, and we maybe felt this reading Plato. How does that world of ideas actually interact with the world of everyday things? And Plato leaves it unexplained. Aristotle wants to explain it. So he retains from Plato a couple of things that Guthrie emphasizes. First, a teleological point of view. Might be an unfamiliar word, but it'll be important in these last couple weeks. Telos, or telos, is the Greek word for an end. meaning the goal of something, right? Where are you going? If you're on a train to Chicago, your telos is Chicago, right? That's your terminus. And so Aristotle agreed with Plato that everything has a kind of natural purpose or end, right? For Plato, this is because of the form that it corresponds to. For Aristotle, the picture's somewhat different, but still it's directed toward an end. Also, he retains from Plato this conviction that reality does lie in the form of things, right? And that's important because all the way back from Parmenides, right, we've seen that this idea of ideas, right, the idea of forms, is how philosophy in this period works. People aren't just thinking about matter. I mean, Democritus aside, he's the guy with the atoms, right? They're trying to understand the deeper meaning of things, and Aristotle retains that project. Here are the differences. For Aristotle, there is no world of forms. He's a one world man, right? But form, he thinks, is immanent in matter. Immanent means within, right? Different from imminent, which means it's coming soon, and eminent, which means important, right? Immanent, right? Within something. So he thinks that each thing that we see is an individual substance, right? Now, that word substance, I mean, we still talk about it like it's not substantial. It means it's not serious or something like this, right? For Aristotle, everything that exists has this. The Greek word is a hypokemenon, a substrate, a base, right? This is what the thing is. And it's tough because we can't really measure the substance directly, right? We can only measure what he calls the accidents in relation to that substance. So maybe the substance is hot or the substance is cold. Okay, there's one thing, the substance, and it has become hot or cold. It has been changed in those different ways, right? This gets around some of the earlier questions that we saw from, again, from Parmenides, for example, right? His question was, how can cold become hot, right? If cold is what it is and hot is what it is, how can one thing become another? Well, Aristotle solves that problem. He says, well, it's not one thing becoming another, right? There is something here that's consistent. It's called the substance of the thing, right? And that substance takes on different accidents or qualities. A second important part of his view that Guthrie emphasizes is that all things in their substance, right, have potentiality and actuality, right? So we use this term in earth science in high school, right? Potential energy and, well, kinetic energy or measurable energy. So the Greek word for potentiality here is dunamis, or get the word dynamic from that, changing, and the word for actuality is energeia, which also means work, right? Or what something is doing actually right now. So in the substance of things, this is the Aristotelian universe, as Guthrie calls this chapter, right? Everything has a substance. Every substance has potential and actuality, right? And so the change of things is the movement of what is in them as potential becoming actual, right? So, typical example, the acorn becomes the oak tree. Is the acorn an oak tree? Kind of, right? Clearly, if you look at it, it doesn't look like the same thing. But within the acorn, remember Aristotle's before genetics and all of this, within the acorn, just philosophically, there is the potential to become an oak tree, right? And so that potential is actualized according to, as he puts it, an inward urge, right? It is the nature of the acorn, if conditions should pertain, allowing for this, for it to become an oak tree. So forms are within the things, and everything has both potential and actuality. Those are important features here. Commenting on this, Guthrie says, the two conceptions here described, immanent form and notion of potential and actual being, are closely interrelated. Right? The view of natural creatures as progressing from the potential to the actual by the virtue of their own dynamic nature, their changing nature, dunamis, cannot be separated in the mind from the analysis of things taken as they stand, which reveals the necessity for an indeterminate substratum capable of being informed to different degrees by qualities which are in themselves untransformable. All right, let's make a little sense of that. What are the qualities? Cold and hot, right? Cold is cold, hot is hot. Cold doesn't become hot, hot doesn't become cold, right? Look at the taps on your sink. Okay, so the causes of the change in the substrate are actually different, right? But the substrate itself is the same. And so Aristotle, thinking about change, how things develop over time, reaches the conclusion about form, right? That, okay, if something is changing, well, there must be something there to change, right? And that thing must have a certain nature. Let's talk a little bit more about change. Today, when we think of change, we think of billiard balls, right? Boom, there goes the billiard ball. This caused this to move. End of story. That's our notion of causality or cause, right? For Aristotle, there are four different causes. Get all four in there. Four different causes, right? We think of cause as the efficient cause. What caused the table? Well, the carpenter. Boom, boom, boom. Table made, right? But Aristotle includes other things. So moving clockwise, the formal cause. This is the design of the table. There's some kind of blueprint or sketch or something. Okay, that also caused the table in a certain way. The material cause, the wood. If there were no wood, there would be no table, right? So that's part of the cause of that thing, the table. And then finally, the final cause. And that's an important one, dining, right? So Aristotle thinks that in each thing that exists, according to its nature, there's a certain appropriate end. Telos, like we said at the beginning, right? So the purpose of a table is dining. If I use a table as a step stool or a chair, right? I mean, we today would say, cool, right? And Aristotle would probably do it too, but he would still say, okay, but when you're doing that, you're using that thing in a way that's contrary to its nature. And you could say down on the lower left here, it's not designed for that, right? So, consequences follow from that, moral consequences, social consequences, the kinds of things we'll get to talk about a bit next week when we look at his Nicomachean Ethics. But all four of these causes drive that process of dynamic change. What is potential becomes actual, right? And the substance realizes its nature. This is the metaphysics, and metaphysics here means, what is beyond just what we can measure, right? What are the kind of underlying concepts that define this worldview? And these are some of the essential ones. A couple more points on this. We're going to go toward God, because Aristotle does talk about God. Guthrie writes, the impossibility of self-caused change results from the juxtaposition of two statements. Juxtaposition means to put two things alongside each other. First, change or motion is a process, or in Aristotle's terms, so long as it continues, the potency, potential, right, in question, is incompletely actualized. Okay, so if I've got a process going on and it's going from point A to point B, I forget a process. I'm going to Chicago again, right? That's a nice one. So I'm in the process of going to Chicago, right? I'm in Philly. Well, I'm not in Chicago, right? So the process of going from New York to Chicago is on the way. It's not yet fully actualized. Okay, let's look at the second point here. Secondly, the agent of change must be already in possession of the form or actuality toward which the object of change is moving, right? So anything that causes the change has to have in itself the potential for what happens, right? And that's important for the God point that we're going to get to, because what Aristotle is going to say is that, when you move back that chain of causes all the way, you got to get to some kind of, not final cause in the sense we said, but ultimate cause, right? Something that caused everything else. And this is actually his argument for God, right? Aristotelian universe, lots of things with their substances, everything is changing and developing, being affected by other things, right? That whole system had to get started in some way. So, in the physical world, from Guthrie. Everything has a cause, an external mover. And that's the billiard ball thing, right? The ball doesn't just move on its own, right? It requires a push. But we need to account for the universe as a whole. So how do you do that? Billiard balls are easy, right? You need God. And the term for God, Aristotle says, this is not a Christian God. This is hundreds of years before Christianity, right? For Aristotle, God is the unmoved mover, right? Almost a philosophical idea. Basically just saying that at the base of this system, at its point of origin, something had to have moved that was not itself moved by anything else, right? And we call that thing God. So as he puts it here, a picture of the cosmos, he gives us, Guthrie says, as a series of concentric spheres that are all moved by God. So now we're moving from God to the planets and the stars, right? This is the Aristotelian universe, after all. So he wants to explain everything in this way. So God does not himself like turn the gears, right? Aristotle's not saying God is pushing things, but he says that God thinks. He's engaged in thought or contemplation, and that thought turns the whole cosmos, right? It is the unmoved mover. This leads to his kind of valorization, let's call it, of life, or that is rather of mind, right? The activity of mind is life, he says. Nous is the word for mind here, right? Nous is life in its highest manifestation. It's not the same thing as just reasoning. So he's not saying that like doing math. Right? Math is wonderful, but he's not saying that doing math is the purpose of all creation, right? That's syllogismos. That's a Greek word. We get our word syllogism from that term used in logic. It's not just like reasoning about things or following logical steps, right? But it's imagining something, contemplating that thing, and in that way, Aristotle thinks, bringing it, in the case of God, into existence. Let's have a few visuals here. So thanks to whomever produced this on the wonderful interwebs. So Aristotle's cosmology. Cosmology is the study of the cosmos. Remember, a cosmos means a beautiful or ordered whole. And so in this picture, we have the Earth at the center, geocentric universe, the moon, all the planets, right? And then you have God as the unmoved mover, turning the wheel, as it were, of all of these things. And Ptolemy there is mentioned in the corner. Okay, moving along briskly. Our next topic is Aristotle's psychology, and I've included a picture of plants because for Aristotle, every living thing, including plants, has a soul, right? That soul is just the actuality of its life, right? So let's have a look at what this means. The word psychology, psychologia, right, means the study of the soul, not just of the mind, as we would say today, but the Greek word for it is psyche or soul. The elements of life in living creatures from plants upward. That's a definition of the soul given by Guthrie. Now, Aristotle wants to avoid the kind of almost religious beliefs of Pythagoras. Remember, Pythagoras had kind of a cult that he set up there in Italy. And Plato himself talks a lot about religion, myths, this kind of thing. He also wants to avoid the materialism of the atomists, these pluralists, Empedocles and Democritus. Right? He thinks that neither of these views is correct. He thinks that a soul has to be conceived as a unity. All of the parts of the soul aren't actually separate parts. Remember Plato's chariot, right? Reason, spiritedness, appetite, three parts of the soul. Aristotle wants to talk about parts. He wants to talk about faculties, right? What can we do with our soul? And also, he wants the body and soul together to be a unity. So you can't have the soul flying off after you die. The word soul simply refers to the actual fact of your living, right? And when you cease to live, your soul ceases to be. There's no kind of cosmic punishment in that or divine retribution. It's just for him a statement of fact, according to his definition of soul. From Guthrie, the body is the matter, and the form or actuality of that body is its life or psyche. If then, he says, one must attempt a definition to cover psyche as a whole, we can say no more than this. It is the actuality of an organic body. When you die, your body, as lovely as it may be, is no longer actual, right? And therefore, again, by definition, your soul ceases to be. The form still precedes the matter for Aristotle, Guthrie emphasizes. But for him, in the individual, this is about the movement we talked about from potential to actual, right? So the form, the soul, gives expression to itself in your body, right? As your body. It is your body. It's the form of your body. But it's not something that's pre-exists your body, like your body is here, right? Here comes the soul. It's going to go into your body, right? And then when you die, it's going to come out. That's not Aristotle's picture. So he's giving us a different notion of soul. Read these passages in Guthrie carefully, because it's different how we usually think about it. As it might be obvious by this point, this is a death blow to any kind of personal immortality. I mean, in the sense of souls existing eternally in heaven, right? Aristotle does not, in his philosophy, allow for that, even though he does, to his own satisfaction, prove the existence of God. Here we have kind of a blurry but very helpful image of the different kinds of souls that Aristotle describes. He talks about these in a book called On the Soul, De Anima, and in that book describes three types: the vegetative soul, the sensitive soul, and the rational soul. All right, laid out nicely here, right? The vegetative soul is plants, pertaining to reproduction and growth, right? Gotta have it if you're a living thing, right? But you can move higher up the chain, and you see that each level kind of incorporates the faculties of the previous level, right? So the plant soul has the faculties of reproduction and growth. Good job, plant soul. But animal soul has mobility and sensation. It can move, it can feel things, right? So your dog has a more complex, a soul with more faculties than your plant, right? It doesn't make the dog better than the plant. The plant is somehow bad, right? They're just different kinds of souls. Human beings, he thinks, have further faculties that belong only to them, and that is thought and reflection, right? The rational soul. So the human being has mobility sensation, hopefully, right? Reproduction and growth. But in addition, it has these further faculties of thought and reflection. So, as we were saying a bit earlier, the soul is the form of the body, right? And the relation of a faculty, for example, sight, to its organ, the eye in that case, is the same as the relation of the soul as a whole to the body as a whole. So this helps us get at that idea of the soul. We still think of the soul as a ghostly thing, right? Kind of coming in, going out. No, that's not here, right? Your eye and your sight. How do you separate those two? Well, I mean, sight feels pretty abstract as a concept, right? I mean, my sight is over here, but my eye is here. No, that's strange, right? Your sight and your eye are the same thing. Sight is the faculty, the power of your eye, right? If your eye doesn't have sight, well, God bless you. But Aristotle would say that as an eye, it's missing a certain faculty that usually, or he would say by nature, belongs to it, right? And so this is the kind of unity we're talking about. This, Guthrie goes on to say, binds the soul and body more closely together, just like the sight and the eye, right? And it also preserves the distinction between purely physical effects and psychical phenomenon of sensation, right? Purely physical effects. Things hit my eye. Got it. I can measure it, study it, right? And the psychical phenomena is of sensation. What is it like to watch a sunset, to see, I don't know, something beautiful, right? That soul phenomenon, the psychic phenomena pertaining to sight, is different from the things hitting my eye, whatever it is, the light rays or so forth. So he's preserving that distinction, but he's trying to hold it together. So again, this is a good example of the soul-body relationship. last line from Guthrie here, the peculiarity of life is that when the bodily organ is materially altered by an external object, then another, totally different results supervene, which we call the sensation, right? So sensation is just, going back to that cause thing, things supervening on, things causing something in me, and then myself having this psychical, this mental sensation, right? This experience on the basis of those external causes. We're already to our third topic. Are you excited? Why don't you go take a break, get a cup of coffee, and come back? Okay, you're back. Vice and virtue. So this is a central pair of concepts in Aristotle's Ethics, and we're going to, of course, read about this next week when we get to the Nicomachean Ethics, but I just want to flag some things now based on Guthrie so you can have a sense of what's coming up. All right, so Aristotle in his Ethics asks the very same question that Socrates and Plato asks, and this is the teleology thing we talked about. What is the goal or function of the human being? In short, what is the human being for? Right? What is the end of a human being? If we're going to look at a human being and say, now that's a good human life, right? What does it look like? What characteristics does it have? Sure, it's different for everybody. I'm on board with that, right? But what does it mean to flourish? And that's Aristotle's big question. And the answer to it will have something to do with our nature as human beings, right? Not only who we are personally, but what we are. The key difference between Plato's and Aristotle's views, as we already mentioned before, is that Aristotle gives up on this idea of a world of ideas, a realm separate from the realm we can see. So ethics for him is not about seeing the form of the good. Remember that from Plato, the cave and all of that, right? Ethics is about anchoring yourself in the facts of everyday life. So Aristotle's going to talk a lot more about observable stuff, right? Distinctions between things, and engage a lot more with those everyday categories rather than focusing just on this kind of vision of the form of the good. So for him, there is not one transcendent form of the good. Ethics is really about practical rules. And so in this respect, Guthrie points out, for Aristotle, ethics isn't really even philosophy at all. Like, if you've lived a bit and you've learned some practical tips and tricks, right, to get through life in the best way and be happy, you're doing ethics, right? But you're not necessarily doing philosophy. I mean, philosophy is all the forms and the potentiality, the actuality, stuff we talked about before, right? This is about everyday practical living. In his Ethics, Guthrie points out in our reading for this week, Aristotle balances the importance of disinterested philosophical and scientific explanation with practical life. So, I mean, it's Aristotle, right? So he's not going to stop thinking. He's not going to stop contemplating, but he is going to say, you got to balance the two, right? So ethics should not only be about rules of thumb and tips and tricks, but also it can't only be about contemplating the form of the good. To him, that doesn't make any sense. He was more interested, Guthrie points out, in science, actually, than in ethics. And he saw, however, that ethics are needed to ensure that our bodily life is well governed by disciplined people. Kind of moving on to his other work there, the politics, in a way. What does this mean? I mean, he's a scientist. So you want to know what the function of a human being is? Let's talk about nutrition, exercise, social relationships, things like this. But he's saying, okay, in order to make all of that possible, we have to not be killing each other, right? We have to have some kind of basis in our polis, in our city, right, where we can relate to each other ethically to enable that kind of flourishing to happen. Important concept for Aristotle here, well, we'll have two of them here. The first bullet point here is arete, which means excellence. What is the excellence of a thing? This is, Guthrie writes, regarded as the proper state or right condition for a mature man. And by that he means human being. It is the precondition requisite for happiness, which is an activity. the energeia of man as such, the activity of man as such. All right, a word on this. So first of all, excellence refers to, think about a violin player. You know when you hear a good violin player, and you know when you hear a really bad violin player. And then once you get into good violin players, there are all kinds of styles and, finer kind of points. But man, if someone can't play, you know that, right? They don't have developed yet the excellence of being a violin player. Doesn't make them a bad person. They just don't have that excellence. Well, Aristotle is saying that just like playing the violin, being human has its own kind of excellence. You can be better or worse at it. It has to do with thought, but also just practical living, right? Um, and when you get really good at it, like the violin player, right, you engage in the activity of being a flourishing human, right? So again, no forms that you're contemplating, right? You're just engaged in life in a balanced, moderate, sustainable, happy way, right? So happiness for him is the activity of living with that excellence, right? It's not an emotion. It's not something that you can grasp and lose, and it's something that you practice exactly as if you were learning an instrument, right? And then when you get skilled at that, then you have achieved the activity of happiness. A big part of this for him, and this relates to the pair of terms we had at the beginning, is virtue and vice, right? So as Aristotle defines it, virtue is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean relative to ourselves, determined by a rational principle, and in a way in which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. Don't worry, we're on minute 31, and I'm not going to drive you nuts going through all of this right now. We're going to pick apart that definition bit by bit next time. But one word that I want to emphasize there is the word mean, right? It doesn't mean being not nice, right? It means an average, right? The mean of, well, I'm not even going to try, right? A mean is an average of two numbers. So virtue, he says, is a state of character, and it has to do with determining what is the kind of middle way. What is the moderate course between extreme courses of action, right? What is the balanced approach that's going to bring us that excellence of human living and therefore to happiness as an activity? Table! So here we have some examples, the most important being courage, the most famous one that we'll talk about briefly, of Aristotle's virtues, right? So the virtue goes right down the middle, right? Courage, temperance, generosity, so forth. And then to either side, you have a vice, right? So a virtue means a good habit. That's literally what the term means. And a vice means a bad habit, right? So when you develop a habit of virtue, take the case of courage, right? Well, what does courage mean? How do I know it when I see it? Well, it's not cowardice. If I'm a coward, something's happening and I run away, I hide under the table. No, please don't hurt me, right? Okay, that's not good. But it's also not foolhardiness. An entire army is running toward me and I run at them with a pencil or something like this. That's silly. You're just going to die, right? So don't be a fool and don't be a coward, right? Be somewhere in between. Use your mind. Plan carefully, right? Be judicious in your actions, but act, right? That, for Aristotle, would be the definition of courage. He talks about this at some length in the Nicomachean Ethics, that specific example. So remember, we develop the virtues in order to become more excellent as human beings, and as a result, to get more and more skilled at this activity he calls happiness. This is his ethics. How do we develop this? Another chart. Thanks to whoever created this. So we engage, let's start at the top. We engage in acts. I am courageous. On Monday, I'm courageous. On Tuesday, I'm courageous. On Wednesday, okay, right? You see. Then, after, 2 weeks, right? After a certain period of time, those acts become a habit, right? And that's what we use the word habit for, right? So once I develop these habits, Over time, again, it's an organic thing, just like a plant grows, we develop. So our habits become part of our character when they become really deeply seated in who we are, right? And then eventually that character forms a certain disposition in us, right? A state of mind, a way of seeing things. So it affects not just how we act, but how we think. And when it reaches that point, then it's really fully part of us, right? And we're getting really close to that excellence. We're getting really close to that happiness. That disposition, in turn, produces more acts, right? And so there is a positive feedback loop here, right? We're moving around from acts, habits, character, disposition, back to acts, right? So for Aristotle, this is the moral life, right? In each particular situation, figuring out what it calls for and responding accordingly. Aristotle asks the question here, is virtue natural or is it contrary to nature? I mean, virtue here could just mean being good. Is it natural for us to be good? Think about like original sin or later concepts like that. Aristotle replies, neither by nature nor contrary to nature do virtues arise in us, but by nature we are adapted to receive them and are made perfect by habit. So by nature, it is going to make me flourish as a human being if I am courageous and generous and prudent and all of those virtues. Um, it's not natural that I should develop them. Like if I just sit around like a plant, right? I'm not going to naturally become courageous. I have to actually do something for that courage to develop. But I am adapted to develop it, right? And I am made perfect in that virtue by repeatedly doing it. So, as Aristotle puts it, we are both potentially good and potentially bad. And so we decide, again, in each moment, particular situation, right, um, using our reason, which way we're going to go. There's a great freedom in Aristotle's virtue ethics, as this picture is called, right? In each moment, you make a free choice, in principle, right, between a good and a bad course of action. And this forms your habits and character and dispositions and what we just had up on the screen. Last point here. Through the activity of nous, remember nous means mind, thinking, we should aim, he says, at divinity as far as lies in our power. Mind, let's say, may be considered the highest and best part of us. It would then be absurd for a man to choose not his own life, but the life of something else. What does he mean by that? Think back to the psychology. Right? What does he say? Plants, animals, human beings. Each one has its own faculties. I'm a human being, right? That means I have thought and reflection. What if I never engage in thought and reflection, right? I never develop that part of myself. Well, why would I do that, right? Why would I not try to develop that in myself, which is highest, which is, as he puts it, closer to that unmoved mover, to God, right? So that's his justification of the life of the mind. Here we have a last slide, which I'm going to read, and then we're going to wrap it up, friends. I hope you took a break. All right. This true and highest happiness, this is Guthrie speaking, right, lies for Aristotle in the theoretical science and philosophy, the unfettered exercise of the intellect for its own sake. Since it is nous which distinguishes man from the beasts, the exercise of nous must clearly be his proper activity qua man, that is, as a human being. Right? Yet immediately after explaining all this, Aristotle goes on, but such a life would be superhuman, for it is not insofar as he is human that a man will live like this, but insofar as there is something of divinity in him. And just as that divinity differs from the concrete whole, even so will its activity differ from the activity of ordinary virtue. If reason is divine, then, in comparison with man, the life according to it, reason, will be divine in comparison with human life. Guthrie concludes, that is how it is. Almost in the same breath, Aristotle can speak of the life of reason as being too high for mortals and exhort us to pursue it as being the life that is most truly our own. I'm going to pass on this last slide. All right, so I'm conscious that the video has skipped a bit here. To wrap up, folks, we've looked at Aristotle's metaphysics, his psychology, and his ethics. I hope you can look back at these sections, listen to them a few times, get a sense for what he's saying, and I look forward to engaging with you on all of these topics in the forums, in our class, and again next week when we actually look at the Nicomachean Ethics. So, thanks.